which will allow us to do that, which will allow us to do that, which will allow us to do that. That's a kind of necessary, pragmatic approach, I think, to having more good to be done than resources to do it. Today is you have to sequentially make some of those leaps. So over the long haul, you advance all the things that are important to you.
Well, and I would also say that this is another area where, I mean, we have some case studies that we could look at. You know, we have Walmart, we have Coleman, where they have received incentives, and we could easily look at that and say, you know, what are the kind of the cost benefit of that, and have information available to us that may not have necessarily been available at the time.
Sure. Okay. Economic development, mentioned again, jobs and retail. Economic development important for creation of jobs. Chris?
Yeah, well, no, and that's, Steve mentioned low-hanging fruit earlier, and we're obviously going to be a transportation hub. We've got a 1,000-acre logistics facility that's being built on our southwest corner. But those aren't always the best paying jobs, and we've talked about in the past, you know, trying to get people to locate here so that we can, or get people to stay here so that we've got next level housing available for them.
Right.
And things of that nature. But some of that involves having jobs that are close to the city as opposed to hopping on I-35 every day. One of the other things that Steve mentioned was that you know, we're at a disadvantage by being a bedroom community, but some of the retail isn't going to come here unless we've got the right numbers. So if we don't continue to grow, then some of the retail people aren't going to want to look at us. However, I'm wondering, there's got to be people out there that are interested in us in advance of that.
Right. Especially
considering we're set up to grow double our size over the next 20 years or so.
Right. And back, I think, to the interrelatedness of many of those goals.
Yeah, and we've got to develop a strategy to attract these people on the front end as opposed to the tail end of the development.
Okay. Let me quickly hit this last page up here too. I know we're closing in towards 8:30. Increase the wealth of community.
That was me. Yeah, basically the way I look at this is, you know, I look at the past, which was, if you look at the census data, you'll see that I think at one time we had close to $50,000 per capita income, and I might have my numbers wrong here, but during the last census we're down to $31,000 per capita. That's a declining trend, and you don't get wealthy by whatever you're doing producing results like that. So, and I'm not saying wealth, you know, individual wealth is a goal, but as a community and as a group of people making policy decisions, you know, it's a very good way to measure how you're doing. I mean, if people want to come to your community and there's a limited amount of houses and they move here bidding up the prices, that's a good thing. It means lower mill rates, means higher, you know, more fluid mechanics in transferring ownership of houses. I mean, it's just a good scenario. So I think there's lots of ways to measure wealth. I mean, I look at publicly held companies as a good way to compare those measurements. You know, there's book value per share, cash per share. There's, you know, capitalization. You know, revenue, income per share, all those things, but we have to decide how we improve the, I'll call it commonwealth of this community. We have to make it a truly something that people want to come to, whether it's for business or to live, set up a church, whatever. And I just think we need to focus on, instead of every, you know, the growth currently has been focused on just growing, and I think we have to have an eye towards, and this is how I feel about many things, I want the person that comes after me to be better off. I want them to have more assets than me. I want them to have more net worth, more disposable income, because I benefit from those environments. I mean, I have more choices of where to eat. If they have more disposable income, they have more assets and property value, my kids get a better funded education.
Right.
So,
You know, and I think the next one, increase the standard of living, is clearly a related. And on many of these, I think you've identified an end in mind, a goal, a principle, and now figuring out what your tangible measure of success might be and where you aspire to be is something that needs to be fleshed out.
but on this point, I think what you have to look at is value. I mean, you know, the first thing I mentioned was sort of a global wealth, and here I feel like we have to look at, for every dollar expended in taxes, you know, do we get the best value? You know, do we promote things that people really want in a great community?
Right.
So, that's what I meant there.
Do you become a community of choice, and what is it that people are choosing and value, and are you providing that value?
Right.
Fairness in all decisions.
That was me too. And here, what I was alluding to was, you know, something I think Steve mentioned, you know, how do you justify tax abatements to big box retailers when mom and pops are going out of business and don't get the same treatment? It's not fair. No one here can think that's fair. I mean, it may be, you know, selfishly advantageous on an individual level, but as a community, it's not the right thing. And, you know, another example was the infrastructure costs that we paid for the school district. We generally don't pay any infrastructure costs for other developers, but here we absorbed all the costs for an area that is much larger than Gardner and includes Edgerton. So Edgerton got a free ride. That's not fair to the citizens of this community.
You know, and oftentimes when you talk about strategy and you talk about the ends in mind and the goals and what we need to do to get there and our long-term vision, the other thing you've got to talk about is core values. You know, what are those things that we hold ourselves accountable to live by? And to me, I think part of this discussion will revolve around who do we aspire to be? What actions will we always take and what ones will we never take? And how do we define that for ourselves as a community? High quality of life, I think another bullet that was touched on by all those other bullets. I mean, I think there's several clear themes that repeat themselves in different words, but speak to a larger point. Economic development, increase commercial to lessen residential burden. I think I've learned two of you were looking off of each other's paper, whoever was sitting next. Very similar to the first one. Increase economic health, mill levy versus budget perspective. Explain that one.
I've had my three, so it's got to be somebody.
I think you read ahead and you said, "Oh, I don't want to explain that one. I'm going to claim Heath."
How many questions are left? Because I got to pace myself. I don't know if I have anything.
This one was one of mine, and I think it's just from the perspective of when you look at it that way that it feeds itself into so many of the other pieces. But when a citizen looks at their tax bill, no one looks at their tax bill and says, "Boy, I'm glad I spent every one of those dollars." But we want them to look at that and then see their quality of life and see everything that comes from those expenses and feel actually that while it may be more than they had hoped to spend, it certainly is a reflection of the quality of life that they've carved for themselves in Gardner.
Okay.
So that's what I feed it. So, I mean, the mill levy, what we're taxing individuals is very reflective of what they're getting from city services and the way they feel about the quality of their life. They may not individually associate one with the other, but if they're happy with the way they live in Gardner and happy with the services they're provided, it actually does relate back to what they're paying for and what we're able to provide to them.
So there's a sense of a return on the investment of the dollars they spend in tax.
That's how I simplify it. I don't know that citizens always look at it that way, but if they did, I would hope that they feel that way, or we need to work to make sure that that's the way they feel.
Okay. I'm curious, Cheryl, when you look at that list up there, what themes do you see? I mean, I think you're listening to this, and no doubt you're trying to think, how do I feed this back into discussions with staff and priorities and fixing this bike and riding it too? What do you take away from that first pass of ideas up there.